The most painful moment was not when my king forgot our anniversary. It was when I realized he had forgotten me long before that night. The grand hall of Aurelian Palace had never felt so quiet. Golden candles lined the long dining table, their warm light reflecting against the polished marble floor. A beautiful celebration had been prepared for two people, but only one person had arrived. Elena Whitmore, the Queen of Aurelian, sat alone beneath the royal banners, watching the candle beside her slowly burn lower. Tonight was supposed to mark 5 years since she and King Adrian Calloway promised to stand beside each other through every season of life. 5 years since he held her hand before the entire kingdom and told her she was the person who made the crown feel less lonely. Elena still remembered those words. She remembered every word because she had built her life around them. She remembered Adrian's favorite dishes, the stories he told when he was tired, and the quiet moments when the weight of ruling a kingdom became too much for him. She had spent years becoming the person who understood him without needing to ask. But tonight, the chair across from her remained empty. The servants avoided her eyes. The musicians had already stopped playing, and the king was still nowhere to be seen. At first, Elena told herself there was a reason. A royal matter. An urgent meeting. Something important that only a king could handle. She had spent years making excuses for him. It was almost natural now. When the palace doors finally opened, the sound echoed through the empty hall. Adrian entered wearing his royal coat, carrying the exhaustion of another long day managing the kingdom. He stopped when he saw the decorations. The table. The candles. Elena. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then realization followed. Elena, he said quietly. I forgot. Those 2 words hurt more than any argument could have. Because they were honest. He had forgotten. Not a meeting. Not a minor detail. Their anniversary. The day they once promised would always belong to them. Elena looked at him and noticed something she had ignored for years. Adrian did not look cruel. He looked surprised, as if he had only just discovered that something important had been missing. I am sorry, Adrian said. The council meeting lasted longer than expected. Elena nodded slowly. She had heard those words before. Not the exact sentence, but the meaning behind them. There was always something more urgent. Something that needed him more. Something that came before her. I understand, she replied. Adrian stepped closer. You know my duties. Elena looked toward the empty chair. Yes, I do. Her voice remained calm. I have always understood your duties. A silence filled the hall. Because Adrian knew she was right. Elena had never asked him to stop being king. She had never asked him to abandon his people. She had only wanted to know that somewhere beneath the crown, there was still a man who remembered he had a wife. I prepared everything myself, Elena said softly. I thought maybe tonight we could remember who we were before everything became about the kingdom. Adrian looked at the table and saw the details he had missed. The flowers chosen because he once said they reminded him of home. The meal prepared with memories from their early years together. The small gift waiting beside his seat. Things he had once noticed. Things he no longer saw. Elena stood slowly. She did not look angry. That was what unsettled him most. Anger would have meant she was still fighting. But Elena looked tired. Are you upset? Adrian asked. She looked at him for a long moment. No. A pause followed. I think I am finally accepting something. Adrian waited. What? Elena looked at the crown resting on his shoulders. Then she looked back at him. That I have spent so much time being your queen that I forgot how to be myself. The words remained in the empty hall after she left. Adrian stayed behind, looking at the untouched dinner meant for 2. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of something greater than a crown. He felt the distance between 2 people who were standing in the same palace but had slowly begun living in different worlds. And Elena, walking away from the celebration she had prepared, made a quiet decision. She would no longer disappear just to make someone else feel loved. The hardest thing about being forgotten was not the moment it happened. It was realizing how long you had been quietly accepting it. After the anniversary night, Elena Whitmore did not leave the palace immediately. She remained where she had always been, surrounded by golden halls, royal advisors, and endless responsibilities. But something inside her had changed. For years, Elena believed love meant patience. She believed understanding meant accepting every missed dinner, every delayed conversation, and every moment when Adrian placed the kingdom before their marriage. She told herself that a queen had to be strong. A queen had to support the king. A queen had to understand the weight of the crown. But she finally began asking herself a different question. Who was supporting her? The morning after the forgotten anniversary, Elena walked through the palace gardens alone. These gardens had once been her favorite place. When she first arrived at Aurelian Palace, Adrian would walk beside her beneath the old trees and ask about her dreams. Back then, he did not see her as a symbol. He saw her as Elena, a woman with hopes, opinions, and a voice of her own. Somewhere along the way, that woman had slowly disappeared behind the title of queen. At breakfast, Adrian noticed the difference immediately. Elena was still polite, still graceful, still everything the kingdom expected from its queen. But she was quieter, not distant, not cold, just no longer reaching for him. Are you still upset about last night? Adrian asked. Elena placed her cup down gently. No. Adrian looked confused. Then what is wrong? She looked at him. Nothing is wrong. The answer surprised him. Because for the first time, Elena was not asking him to fix anything. She was not explaining her feelings. She was not trying to make him understand. She was simply accepting what she had already learned. Adrian frowned slightly. Elena, if something is bothering you, you should tell me. She gave a small smile. I spent years telling you. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of every forgotten moment. Adrian had no immediate response, because deep down he knew she was right. Elena had told him. She had mentioned wanting more time together. She had asked for simple evenings without royal meetings interrupting them. She had tried to create moments where they could be husband and wife instead of only king and queen. But Adrian always believed there would be more time later. Later had become years. That afternoon, Elena visited the royal archives. Not for political documents. Not for matters of the crown. She searched for something that belonged only to herself. Old records from before her marriage. Letters. Research notes. The writings she had created before becoming queen. She found a collection of studies she had abandoned 5 years earlier. Before the crown. Before the palace. Before she became someone everyone needed, but no one truly knew. She ran her fingers across the pages and smiled sadly. She remembered that woman. The woman who spent nights studying because she loved learning. The woman who dreamed about creating something meaningful. The woman who existed before she became defined by someone else's expectations. That evening, Elena made a decision. She would not abandon her duties. She would not punish Adrian. She would not create a scene for the palace to discuss. Instead, she would simply stop disappearing. She began removing small parts of her life that only existed because they served Adrian. She stopped changing her schedule around every royal request. She returned to her studies. She spent time with people who knew her before the crown. The changes were subtle, but Adrian noticed. The queen who once waited outside his office after every meeting was no longer there. The woman who remembered every detail about his day no longer asked about every detail. At first, Adrian thought Elena was angry. Then he realized something much more unsettling. She was peaceful. She was no longer trying to be seen. She had finally started seeing herself. And for the first time, King Adrian Calloway wondered if he had mistaken Elena's endless patience for endless love. Because love was not something that survived simply because one person kept holding on. Sometimes love faded quietly when one person carried it alone. The moment Elena Whitmore stopped waiting was the moment Adrian Calloway finally noticed the silence. For years, the king had grown comfortable with the rhythm of palace life. He believed Elena would always be there when he returned from meetings, when he needed advice, and when the weight of ruling became overwhelming. She had been the steady presence behind every successful decision, the person who understood his thoughts before he spoke them. But Adrian never considered what would happen if that presence slowly stepped away. He began noticing small changes throughout the palace. The queen no longer stayed awake late at night preparing notes for his morning discussions. She no longer appeared outside the council chambers with a warm smile and a reminder that he had forgotten to rest. She no longer adjusted her entire schedule around his responsibilities. At first, Adrian thought Elena was simply giving him space. Then he realized something that made him uncomfortable. Elena was not waiting for him anymore. Meanwhile, Elena returned to the parts of herself she had abandoned. In the quiet hours of the morning, she continued her studies in the royal archives. She reviewed old writings, unfinished projects, and ideas she had created before marriage. Every page reminded her that she had once been someone with dreams beyond the walls of the palace. She had not become a queen because she wanted power. She became a queen because she loved Adrian and believed they were building something together. But somewhere along the way, she had confused devotion with disappearance. She thought loving someone meant making herself smaller so they could shine brighter. Now she understood that love should allow both people to exist fully. When news spread that Elena had returned to her own research, members of the court were surprised. Many had only known her as the graceful queen who stood beside Adrian during ceremonies. They had forgotten that before the crown, Elena was a talented scholar with her own achievements. The more she stepped into her own identity, the more people began to see her differently. Not as the king's wife, not as a royal figure, but as Elena Whitmore. Adrian heard the conversations around the palace. He heard advisors praising Elena's intelligence and discussing her ideas. For the first time, he listened to stories about her that had nothing to do with him. It created a strange feeling inside him. Pride, regret, and something he was not ready to admit. He had spent years standing beside Elena without truly seeing her. One evening, Adrian found himself walking through the palace gardens where Elena used to spend time. He remembered how she once told him about her dreams. She wanted to create a place where young scholars could learn freely. She wanted to preserve forgotten histories. She wanted to contribute something meaningful to the world. Adrian remembered smiling at those dreams and promising that someday they would make them happen. But someday never came. The kingdom always needed another decision, another meeting, another responsibility. Adrian had convinced himself that Elena understood. He never asked whether understanding meant she was hurting. When he finally found Elena in the garden, she was reading one of her old research journals. She looked peaceful, not because everything was perfect, but because she had stopped waiting for someone else to give her permission to be herself. "You seem different," Adrian said. Elena looked up and smiled gently. "I think I am finally becoming who I was before I forgot myself." Adrian stood quietly. He wanted to say that he missed the old Elena, but the words felt wrong. Because the old Elena was the woman who had sacrificed pieces of herself to keep their marriage alive. And now he was seeing the woman who remained after those sacrifices ended. "Are you leaving me?" Adrian finally asked. Elena closed the journal. "I am not leaving you, Adrian." She paused. "I am leaving behind the person I became when I thought being loved meant disappearing." Those words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. Because for the first time, Adrian understood that Elena's change was not an attempt to punish him. It was an attempt to save herself. And that realization was far more powerful than any accusation could have been. Adrian Calloway had faced countless challenges as king of Aurelian. He had negotiated with rival kingdoms, carried the expectations of an entire nation, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But nothing had prepared him for the quiet distance growing between him and Elena Whitmore. Because for the first time, Adrian was not fighting to solve a problem. He was facing the consequences of one. The palace had not changed. The halls were still decorated with gold and ancient symbols of royalty. The advisors still waited for his decisions. The kingdom still looked to him as their leader. Yet something important was missing. Elena, not physically. She was still there. She attended ceremonies, fulfilled her duties, and represented the crown with the same grace she always had. But the woman who once looked at him with endless patience was no longer trying to reach him. Adrian began noticing how much of his daily life had depended on her quiet support. When he entered a council meeting, the documents were already organized. When he needed information about important matters, Elena had often prepared everything before he even asked. When he struggled with difficult choices, she had always been the person who reminded him to consider the human side of every decision. He had thought those things happened naturally. He had never stopped to wonder how much effort was behind them. One afternoon, Adrian visited the royal archives and found a collection of Elena's previous work. He expected simple research notes. Instead, he discovered years of ideas, studies, and plans that revealed a side of her he barely knew. Elena had written about education, history, and ways to improve life throughout the kingdom. She had visions that extended far beyond the palace walls. Adrian turned each page slowly, realizing something painful. He had always introduced her as his queen. He had rarely introduced her as Elena. That evening, Adrian watched Elena present her newest proposal to the royal council. She spoke with confidence. Her voice was calm and clear. The advisors listened carefully, not because she was married to the king, but because her ideas deserved attention. Adrian sat silently, watching the woman. Before him, She was the same person he had loved years ago, yet somehow he was seeing her for the first time. After the meeting ended, Adrian approached her. "Why did you never tell me about these plans?" he asked. Elena looked at him thoughtfully. "I did." Her answer surprised him. "You did?" "Many times," she said gently. "But there was always something more urgent. Another meeting. Another responsibility. Another reason why we would talk later." Adrian lowered his eyes. He wanted to disagree, but he could not. Because he remembered. He remembered every time Elena had started a conversation and he had promised to continue it another day. He remembered every moment he assumed she would understand. "I thought you were happy," Adrian admitted. Elena smiled sadly. "I was happy when I felt like we were building something together." She paused. "But somewhere along the way, I became someone who only existed to support what you were building." The honesty of her words affected him more than anger ever could. Elena was not blaming him. She was simply telling him the truth. That night, Adrian walked through the palace alone. He passed the places where Elena had spent years creating comfort for everyone around her. The library where she studied, the gardens where she waited for him, the rooms where she quietly carried responsibilities nobody noticed. He finally understood the difference between having someone beside you and truly seeing them. Elena had not disappeared because she stopped caring. She had disappeared because she had spent too long making sure everyone else was seen. And now, Adrian faced the reality he had avoided. The queen he thought he knew had always been much more than a crown beside his own. She was a person with dreams, ambitions, and a life that deserved to exist beyond him. For the first time, the king did not wonder how to bring Elena back to the way she was. He wondered how he could become someone worthy of the woman she was becoming. Elena Whitmore had spent years standing beside the throne, but now she was learning how to stand on her own. The change was not sudden. It did not happen because of one argument or one painful night. It happened through countless small moments when she finally chose herself instead of constantly waiting for someone else to notice her. For the first time in years, Elena began making decisions based on what she wanted, not what would make the palace more comfortable. She moved her personal study from the quiet corner of the royal residence to a larger room overlooking the gardens. It was a simple change, but it represented something much bigger. This space was no longer only for royal duties. It was a place where Elena could create, research, and remember who she had been before becoming queen. The servants noticed the difference. The advisors noticed the difference. Even the people of Aurelian began noticing the difference. The queen who once appeared only beside the king during official events was now known for her own achievements. Her research projects gained attention throughout the kingdom. Her ideas helped improve educational programs and preserve important historical records. People began speaking about Elena Whitmore, not only Queen Elena. Meanwhile, Adrian Calloway struggled with a feeling he had never experienced before. He was not angry. He was not offended. He was simply uncertain. For years, he had believed Elena's place was beside him because she loved him. Now he wondered if he had confused her loyalty with happiness. One evening, Adrian entered the royal library and found Elena reviewing documents. Unlike before, she did not immediately put everything aside when he arrived. She looked up, smiled politely, and continued organizing her work. That small action affected him more than he expected. The old Elena would have stopped everything for him. The new Elena respected her own time. "You have been very busy lately," Adrian said. Elena looked at the papers in front of her. "I suppose I have. You seem happier." Elena smiled softly. "I am." Adrian was quiet. He wanted to say he was glad, but a small part of him was afraid of what her happiness meant. Because Elena had found peace without depending on him. "Do you regret our marriage?" Adrian finally asked. Elena looked surprised by the question. "No." Her answer came immediately. "I do not regret loving you." Adrian looked at her carefully. "Then what do you regret?" Elena closed the document in her hands. "I regret forgetting that I was someone before I became your queen." Those words stayed with Adrian. Because he realized Elena was not trying to erase their history. She was trying to reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. A few days later, Elena received an invitation from a prestigious academy outside the capital. They wanted her to lead a new research program based on her work. It was an opportunity she would have once refused. Not because she did not want it, but because she would have worried about leaving Adrian alone. This time, she accepted. When Adrian heard the news, he expected to feel abandoned. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Pride. He realized Elena was not walking away from him. She was walking toward herself. That night, Adrian stood on the balcony overlooking the palace gardens. He remembered the woman who once waited there for him after long days of ruling. He remembered how easily he assumed she would always be waiting. But Elena was no longer standing in the same place. She was moving forward. And Adrian finally understood a truth he should have learned years earlier. Love was never about keeping someone close enough that they could not leave. Love was about caring enough to let them become everything they were meant to be. For the first time, Adrian did not want Elena to return to the person she was before. He wanted to know the woman she was becoming. Adrian Calloway had spent his entire life learning how to carry responsibility. As king of Aurelian, he understood duty, tradition, and sacrifice. But there was one lesson he had never truly learned until now. A crown could teach someone how to rule a kingdom, but it could not teach someone how to love the person standing beside them. After Elena accepted the invitation from the academy, Adrian expected the palace to feel empty. He expected the silence to remind him of what he had lost. Instead, the silence showed him something even more difficult. It showed him how much Elena had carried alone. He began looking back at years of their marriage with a different perspective. Moments he once considered ordinary suddenly seemed meaningful. The evenings when Elena waited for him after council meetings. The letters she wrote reminding him to take care of himself. The countless times she supported his decisions even when nobody else knew how much effort she had given. Adrian realized he had always noticed the results of Elena's love, but he rarely noticed the love itself. One morning, Adrian found an old painting in the palace gallery. It was a portrait from shortly after their wedding. Elena stood beside him with a bright expression, not because she was a queen, but because she believed they were creating a future together. Adrian stared at the painting for a long time. He remembered the woman she had been before the weight of expectations changed everything. He remembered her laughter, her curiosity, her dreams. Then he realized something painful. He had not lost Elena because she changed. He had lost the connection between them because he stopped seeing her. A few weeks later, Adrian traveled to the academy where Elena was working. He did not arrive with royal guards or a grand announcement. He came simply as Adrian. When Elena saw him, she looked surprised. "What brings you here?" she asked. Adrian took a moment before answering. In the past, he would have searched for the perfect words. He would have tried to explain everything quickly. This time, he chose honesty. "I came to apologize." Elena remained quiet. Adrian continued. "Not because I forgot one important day. That was only a symbol of something much bigger. I forgot to notice you. I forgot that you were not only my queen. You were a person with your own dreams, your own hopes, and your own life." Elena listened carefully. She appreciated the words, but she did not immediately accept them. Because apologies were easy. Change was harder. "Why now, Adrian?" she asked. He looked at the academy around them. Students walking through the halls. Scholars discussing ideas. A place where Elena was valued for who she was. "Because I finally understand that I cannot ask you to come back to a life where you had to disappear." Elena looked away for a moment. "You know, I never wanted a perfect king." Adrian listened. "I never needed you to solve everything. I only wanted you to remember that I was standing beside you." Her words were gentle, but they carried years of emotion. Adrian nodded slowly. "I know." For the first time, he did not defend himself. He did not explain his responsibilities. He simply accepted the truth. Elena noticed the difference. The old Adrian would have focused on proving he was not wrong. This Adrian was willing to understand why she had been hurt. "I do not know what happens next," Elena said. Adrian nodded. "Neither do I." A small silence passed between them. But unlike the silence in the palace, this one did not feel cold. It felt honest. "I am not asking you to return to the palace," Adrian said. "I am not asking you to forgive everything today. I only want the chance to become someone who deserves your respect." Elena looked at him. For the first time in a long while, she saw the man she once loved beneath the title of king. Not a ruler trying to control the outcome. Just someone finally learning from his mistakes. When Adrian returned to Aurelian, he carried no promise that everything would return to the way it was. Because both of them knew the past could not simply be rewritten. But for the first time, they were no longer trapped by it. Elena had found herself again. Adrian had finally begun to understand her. And somewhere between distance and honesty, they discovered the possibility of something they had lost long ago. A relationship built not on duty, but on choice. Elena Whitmore had once believed that love meant staying no matter how difficult things became. She believed commitment meant carrying the weight together, even when one person carried more than the other. But after leaving the palace and discovering herself again, she understood something important. Love could only survive when both people were willing to show up, not just one. After Adrian returned from the academy, he did not immediately ask Elena to come back. He did not send royal invitations or create grand gestures meant to impress the court. Instead, he began making changes quietly. For the first time, Adrian focused on becoming a different person rather than trying to restore the old relationship. He started spending time with the advisors who had once only seen him as a king. He listened instead of immediately making decisions. He asked questions instead of assuming he already knew the answers. The people around him noticed the difference. The king who once seemed impossible to reach was finally learning how to connect. But Elena remained careful. She saw the changes, and she appreciated them. But she refused to forget the years when she had felt invisible. She had spent too long rebuilding herself to return to the same place without knowing whether anything had truly changed. Months passed, and Elena continued her work at the academy. Her research gained recognition throughout Aurelian, and she became known for her own achievements. She no longer needed the crown to prove her value. She had finally learned that her worth existed before anyone gave her a title. One afternoon, Adrian visited the academy again. This time, he did not come to apologize. He came to share something important. "The council approved your education program," he said. Elena looked surprised. "My program?" Adrian smiled. "Yes, not the Queen's program. Elena's program." The simple distinction meant more than he realized. For years, she had been introduced through her relationship with him. Now, he was recognizing her as an individual. "Thank you," Elena said quietly. Adrian nodded. "I should have said that years ago." They walked through the academy gardens together. The conversation was different from before. There was no pressure, no expectation that Elena would make a decision immediately. Adrian simply listened as she talked about her plans and ideas. He asked about her thoughts, her challenges, and her hopes for the future. It was something so simple, yet something they had rarely done. Later that evening, Elena reflected on the moment. She realized Adrian was no longer trying to bring back the woman who had waited for him in the palace. He was finally getting to know the woman who had grown beyond that life. However, there was still one question between them. Could two people who had been hurt by the past create something new? Not rebuild what they had lost, but create something different? Adrian understood that an apology could open a door, but only consistent actions could keep it open. He knew Elena did not need promises. She needed to see that she mattered. Not because she was his queen, not because she supported his role, but because she was Elena. One evening, Adrian and Elena stood beneath the old trees in the academy garden. It was the same kind of place where they once dreamed about the future together. But this time, neither of them was pretending everything was perfect. "I miss who we were," Adrian admitted. Elena looked at him. "So do I." He seemed surprised. "You do?" She smiled gently. "Yes, but I do not want to become who I was again." Adrian understood immediately. The woman he loved was not asking to return to the past. She was asking if there could be a future where she did not have to lose herself. "Then we start from here," Adrian said. "Not as king and queen." He paused. "As Adrian and Elena." For the first time in years, Elena felt no pressure to answer. She did not need to decide out of duty. She did not need to stay because of a promise made long ago. She could choose freely. And that freedom was exactly what she had been searching for all along. Elena Whitmore had spent months learning how to live without depending on a crown, and Adrian Calloway had spent those same months learning how to become someone who deserved her trust again. Neither of them expected the journey to be simple. They both understood that the past could not be erased with a few kind words or a single apology. Some wounds were created slowly, and healing them required patience. For Elena, the most important change was that she no longer measured her happiness by whether Adrian noticed her. She had built a life where her dreams mattered. She had created friendships, expanded her research, and found purpose beyond the walls of the palace. She was still the same Elena, but she was no longer the woman who believed love required her to disappear. For Adrian, the greatest lesson was understanding that love was not proven through grand promises. It was shown through small choices made every day. He began visiting the academy not as a king seeking approval, but as Adrian, wanting to understand Elena's world. He listened to her ideas. He asked about her work. He remembered details that once would have escaped his attention. Slowly, Elena noticed the difference. Not because Adrian told her he had changed, but because his actions showed it. One evening, they sat together in the academy garden beneath the same old trees where they had spoken months earlier. The atmosphere was peaceful. There was no palace ceremony, no advisors watching, no expectations from the kingdom, just two people having an honest conversation. I used to think losing you meant losing my wife, Adrian said quietly. Elena looked at him. And now, Adrian looked toward the garden. Now I understand. I almost lost the person you were before you became my wife. Elena remained silent, allowing his words to settle. Because that was the difference between the old Adrian and the man sitting beside her now. The old Adrian focused on what he had lost. The new Adrian was beginning to understand what he had failed to appreciate. I do not want you to return because you feel responsible for the kingdom, Adrian continued. I do not want you beside me because tradition says you should be there. He paused. If you ever choose to stand beside me again, I want it to be because Elena wants to. Not because the queen is expected to. Those words mattered. Because for years, Elena had carried the responsibility of being a queen. Now, for the first time, someone was asking what Elena wanted as a person. You know, she said softly. There was a time when I thought the only way to save our marriage was to hold on tighter. Adrian listened carefully. But sometimes holding on too tightly only makes people forget how to breathe. He nodded. I know. A gentle silence followed. This silence was different from the one they shared in the palace after the forgotten anniversary. That silence had been filled with disappointment. This one was filled with understanding. Over the following months, Elena and Adrian continued building something new. They did not rush to recreate their old relationship. Instead, they learned how to communicate honestly. They learned how to disagree without distance. They learned how to respect each other's goals. When Adrian returned to the palace, he carried Elena's ideas with him. Not as the king presenting his queen's work, but as a leader recognizing the importance of another person's vision. When Elena visited the capital, she was welcomed not only as the queen, but as a respected scholar and creator. The kingdom began seeing what Adrian had finally learned. Elena was never simply a woman standing beside a throne. She was someone who had her own light. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Adrian and Elena stood together again beneath the palace gardens. The anniversary that once represented distance had become something different, not a reminder of what was broken, but proof of how much they had both grown. Adrian looked at her and smiled. Do you think we found our way back? Elena thought carefully before answering. No. Adrian looked surprised. She smiled. I think we found a new way forward. And that was the truth they both needed. They were not returning to who they had been. They were becoming people who could finally choose each other without losing themselves. 1 year had passed since Elena Whitmore first realized she had disappeared inside her own life. The woman who once sat alone in the palace waiting for a forgotten anniversary had become someone completely different. Not because she stopped caring, not because she stopped loving, but because she finally understood that love should never require a person to lose themselves. The kingdom of Aurelian had changed as well. People no longer spoke about Elena only as the queen beside King Adrian Callaway. They spoke about her research, her achievements, and the changes she helped create throughout the kingdom. She had become a symbol of something greater than royalty. She became proof that a person could begin again even after spending years believing their purpose belonged to someone else. Adrian noticed this every day. He saw how naturally Elena moved through the world now. She carried herself with confidence, not because she wore a crown, but because she knew her own worth. And that was the person he admired most. On the morning of their anniversary, Adrian arrived at the academy where Elena was finishing her latest project. This time, he remembered. But more importantly, he understood why remembering mattered. It was not about a date on a calendar. It was about recognizing the person connected to that memory. He found Elena standing near the garden, reviewing notes for her next research project. When she saw him, she smiled. You remembered, she said. Adrian smiled softly. I did. A quiet moment passed between them. It was a simple exchange, but both of them understood how much had changed. The old Adrian would have thought remembering the anniversary was enough. The new Adrian knew that one moment could never replace years of effort. I brought something for you, he said. Elena looked curious. Instead of a royal gift, Adrian handed her a small collection of carefully preserved documents. She opened them and realized they were copies of her earliest research papers from before she became queen. Elena looked surprised. "How did you find these?" Adrian smiled. "I searched the archives." She looked through the pages quietly. "You kept them?" "I should have valued them years ago," he replied. "I should have valued you years ago." Elena looked at him. The words were sincere, but she also knew something important. This moment was not about forgiveness arriving instantly. It was about recognizing the journey they had both taken. "Adrian," she said gently, "I need you to understand something." He listened. "I am not the woman who left the palace anymore." He nodded. "I know, and I do not want to become her again." Adrian smiled. "I would never ask you to." That answer meant more than any promise, because Elena no longer needed someone to convince her that she mattered. She already knew. Later that evening, they walked through the palace gardens together. The same gardens where Elena once waited for a king who was always too busy to notice. But this time, everything felt different. The palace was still the same. The crown was still there. The responsibilities still existed. But the people carrying them had changed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I never left?" Elena asked. Adrian considered the question. "I think we would have continued believing everything was fine." She nodded. "Maybe." He looked at her. "But I am grateful you chose yourself." Elena smiled. "And I am grateful you finally learned how to see me." They continued walking beneath the evening sky, not as two people trying to repair the past, but as two people creating something new. Their story was no longer about a queen waiting for her king to remember her. It was about two individuals who learned that love was not built from sacrifice alone. It was built from respect, understanding, and the freedom to choose each other every day. Elena had not disappeared. She had found herself. Adrian had not simply won back the person he lost. He had learned to appreciate the person who had always been there. And in the end, that was the greatest change of all. The queen no longer needed the crown to know her value. The king no longer needed power to prove his love. They finally understood that the strongest bond was not created by duty. It was created when two people could stand together while still remaining completely themselves.